The EU's chief says Europe is Africa's most reliable partner. But after decades of neglect, can it fill the void as China steps back and Russia looks to extend its influence? Emmanuel Macron has long called for a reset of this relationship, as far back as 2017, when he declared the end of Francafrique. Is this more rhetoric, and is it time for Africa to stop asking for European aid? Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. It's been 5 years since the European Union and Africa sat around a table to discuss issues affecting both continents. While Europe says prosperity is the top topic for discussion, the issues of terrorism and migration are still preoccupying European capitals. According to the African Union, the summit later this week plays an important role in moving beyond a donor-recipient relationship towards long-term cooperation, with Africa being treated as more of an equal to Europe as it moves away from its colonial past. However, British companies still control $1 trillion of Africa's valuable resources, and France is estimated to hold nearly $500 billion of African countries' money in its treasury. So is a partnership of equal footing even possible? So let me introduce today's guests. Here in the studio, we have Alex Vines, Director of the Africa Programme at Chatham House. In Washington, D.C., Gyude Moore, Senior Policy Fellow at the Centre for Global Development. And in Ghent, in Belgium, Geert Laporte, Director of the European Think Tanks Group. Gentlemen, great to have you with me. Let's start with you, Geert. Emmanuel Macron says the upcoming EU-AU summit will completely overhaul the relationship. It's going to be more of an equal partnership. I know you're going to be an observer at the summit. Do you share that optimism?
Well, I would say that every time when there is a summit, that there are always these types of bombastic declarations. This is the summit that will make the difference. It will break with all previous summits that we had. It will be a very different one this time. I don't believe that very much. I think there is, at this moment, in the relationship between Europe and Africa, quite a few elements of divergence that first need to be tackled. And if I would have to talk about divergences, they both relate to the content of the partnership, but also to the tone and the way in which both continents are dealing with each other. And this is really a big challenge also for this summit, to change this partnership, which is sometimes mentioned by the European side as the partnership of equals, but which in practice is not really an equal partnership.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of the divergences in this show. Gyude, do you agree with that there is going to be some discussion about the whether there is a real partnership? One of Europe's goals, for example, is to boost development in Africa, and presumably post-COVID, that's something that African nations are also very keen to do.
This is great. Again, thanks for having me. I agree with the previous speaker about what to expect, of how far-reaching this will be. But the president of the EU is in Senegal, and she unveiled the first projects of the Global Gateway. So it looks as if Europe is making an attempt to come true on the promises that it's making to Africa. And as you know, there's been significant scarring from the COVID pandemic, economic scarring. And so investment and development is high on the agenda of African countries. So the hope is this summit would actually deliver slightly better outcomes than the one that have come before. But I think for most African policymakers, the attitude is cautious optimism.
Alex, what are your views? Because clearly the EU wants to consolidate its ties with African nations, especially in the face of competition from China, from Russia. Do you agree that tone is going to be very important in this?
Tone is important. And I mean, Geert and myself have been following these summits since the first one in Cairo in 2001. And so you can see an improvement in the tone. Okay, there are bombastic statements each time that this...
And promises made. I mean,
well,
promises made in
each
Abidjan.
summit there has headlines that it's going to be different, it's going to be a more equal partnership. But what you are seeing is gradually, particularly from the EU side, a recognition that there needs to be more equality within that partnership between the African Union and the EU. And so Global Gateway that we've just heard about from Gyude, it is one of those things that Europe is trying to show that it will deliver more things than just developmental money and security. It will also provide foreign direct investment and transformative funding. So step by step, I don't believe all the headline statements that we're getting at the moment about what this summit will deliver. But if you look at it as part of a journey, then each summit is a step in a positive direction.
Okay, well, we've already mentioned the Global Gateway Investment Plan. Let's just talk about what that is. This is Europe's response to competing with China's influence. It's a multi-billion-dollar set of investments to improve infrastructure. Here's what Ursula von der Leyen had to say about it.
Global Gateway will mobilize 300 billion euros till 2027. It will invest around the world to support our priorities, that is the green and the digital transition. And the third topic for implementation is, of course, political leadership. You have to take it to the upper level. Therefore, it is here anchored at the highest political level. And we will bring it forward. For example, the first test case will be the African Union, European Union summit that we will have in spring, just to show these are the first flagships we're starting now, bringing to this project and making them happen.
Gyude, this idea that the donor-recipient relationship is changing, is that feasible? And do African countries believe that that donor-recipient relationship is changing? Or do they feel that there's still a sort of paternalistic attitude from Europe?
I think it's both, right? So on the African side, there has been, over the years, call for the quality of the relationship to shift, for more investment in the productive sectors of the African economy, especially as far as infrastructure is concerned. And both Global Gateway and the US B3W is a response to what the Chinese have been doing. So China is still a development partner of most African countries, but China has invested significantly in African infrastructure. And this is what the Africans have been asking of the European counterparts for a while. So yes, it is possible, because we've seen that happen with China over the last 2 decades. The Chinese have lent $153 billion to African countries. More than 56% of that has gone into infrastructure. And this is the kind of spending, the kind of investment that Africans have looked to the European counterparts for. So if Europe wants to go in that direction now, it's a bit late, but it's better late than never.
Geert, what do you think about these types of investment? Does Africa trust Europe to have its best interests at heart, or does it think that Europe is still trying to be a dominant partner in the relationship? I'm interested in this sort of idea of an equal partnership.
Well, the Global Gateway, of course, is a kind of European response to the Belt and Road Initiative, as was said. 300 billion euros up to 2027 that Europe is willing to invest in different parts in the world, not only in Africa, but mainly in Africa. What we have noticed as think tank group is that a lot of that money that has been committed is in fact rebranded money, are resources that were already committed through other types of instruments. So for many Africans, this is perceived to be resources that are not necessarily new, that are not necessarily adding up to other types of commitments that were already made in the course of the years. Having said that, I believe that there is, of course, also something to be said about the African expectations in relation to European financial commitments towards Africa. I think part of the unbalanced relationship, part of the unequal relationship between both sides of the partnerships relates very much to that North-South type of relationship. And we should break away from that. We should find ways where the European side, of course, puts in resources, but where the African side also tries to build on own resources, matching funds. This will give much more autonomy to the African side in the dialogue with the European institutions, particularly when it comes to its financing of their own institutions in Africa. And the African Union, large parts of their programs, security programs and so on, are still paid for by the international donor community. And I don't think that this is healthy.
In fact, let's use that as a jumping off point to look at some of the challenges in the relationship. And one issue, of course, you mentioned security there, Geert. One of the issues causing contention is the current state of insecurity and instability in parts of Africa. Alex, if I can come to you, 5 military coups, a growing sentiment among some countries, notably Mali, against Europe, against France in particular. How is that going to play into this upcoming summit?
It's a big concern, and it will be one of the things that's discussed in one of the roundtables. There's a particular focus on peace, security, and governance. I think the problem for the EU is that its new strategy towards the Sahel from last year is already a bit outdated by events that have happened this year. And it still emphasizes security sector reform. It talks about building up better capacity and support of governments, as well as governance. The problem is that a number of the governments, so the heads of state that are coming to the summit, are part of the problem. They're not part of the solution. They are seen as illegitimate by parts of their population. And so this is a challenge when actually some of the real pressures that are building up in the Sahel are from non-state actors, some of them very progressive ones within civil society, but they don't have much room for a voice at this summit, which is very statist. It is in the end a coalition of EU states talking significantly to their African counterparts. So there's got to be a rethink, I think, in terms of going forward. If we are to find lasting solutions for very fragile parts of the African continent, which the Sahel is a primary one at the moment.
And the fact that terrorism has increased in some of these sub-Saharan
Well,
countries.
and it's a big challenge. So the EU is thinking, is its European Union training missions in the Sahel successful? Which I think the answer is it's not. How can that be more useful and effective? And there's a paradox here. We need to get development in, but security is really deteriorating. So these are the big questions that both Europe and Africa are going to have to think about, I believe, together, because at the end of the day, unlike Russia and China, what happens in West Africa and the Sahel, that's European near abroad, that's neighborhood. So Europeans will be more concerned about this long term, about the stability and success of that region than many other countries.
I suppose it's fair to say that there's a lot of interconnectedness here. If you improve security and stability in a country, you will improve prospects and the economy. Gyude, how difficult is this issue going to be about security and terrorism in some of those African nations for Europe to deal with? And are they going to talk about it at this summit, do you think?
I think it will. It's become such a big thing because it's not just the insecurity. We have had military using the insecurity as a justification for overthrowing the constitutional order. But we also have whole regions of the Sahel that have had no reasonable or measurable impact of the state in their lives. I mean, people without infrastructure, people without social services, and in some instances, people who have had this situation for decades. And so because of that, there are multiple factors playing into the insecurity that we're seeing currently happening in the region, and it has to come on the table. But as your studio guest noted, who's coming for Mali? Who's coming for Burkina Faso? Who's coming for Guinea? Because they've all had coup d'etats. Are those leaders accepted at the table? And when you recognize them at the table, are you condoning the overthrow of the constitutional order? So it is a difficult thing. But I also want to go back to what he said earlier, what the guest from Ghent said earlier, that at some point, for Africans to be accepted and treated as equals, then we will have to begin to pay for some of these things ourselves. That the regional security has to become the responsibility of ECOWAS, it has to become the responsibility of the AU with assistance from the EU. So it's not just Europe that has to treat the relationship differently. Africans themselves would have to approach the relationship differently if we're going to be a relationship of partners and equals.
And Geert, I saw you nodding at that. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Yes, I absolutely agree with this. I think that one of the contradictions in this Africa-Europe business is that both parties always say we want a partnership beyond aid. But within the same phrase, many of the African leaders ask for more aid. And this is something which is very strange, this contradiction. I think it relates very much to vested interests. It relates to being used, being addicted to receiving aid. And of course, the European side is very happy to provide aid because it buys influence through aid. And I think we need to find ways there to bring more balance. It doesn't mean that the Europeans should, of course, not fund and invest in Africa. Of course, they should provide all types of different types of funding to Africa, but it should always be on the basis of matching funding. It should be on the basis of African institutions that decide themselves over their own fate.
One of the other issues that ties directly into the security of the region is the issue of migration. Now, that is going to be something else that there will have to be talks about, because some of the African leaders are saying, look, this has to be a shared responsibility. Is this an area where agendas diverge because there is increasing migration from African countries towards Europe, and Europe, of course, wants to close its borders to that?
Well, in the run-up to the fifth EU-Africa summit in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, the migration issue was very, very prominent. And of course, there was a Valletta meeting also between the EU and Africans discussing this issue. It is one of the key issues of strategic interest for European countries, which is this concern of uncontrolled migration into Europe. The solutions are not to create a fortress Europe. It is about finding ways both of encouraging development and prosperity in Africa, but also, I believe, longer term in a circular migration model, where
because a lot of African nations
can
legal avenues.
There'll be legal avenues. Africans can come to European countries. They can remit. They can learn, and also maybe find ways of also skills transfer of people from Europe also working within Africa. In the end, these are, Europe and Africa are neighboring continents, so it is in both parties' interests, I think, to work something out along those lines. But in the short term, I think this is too politically complicated, particularly for Europeans, to accept that a fortress Europe clamping down on illicit migration isn't working.
Let's move the conversation to another challenge between African nations and European nations. African nations frustrated by Europe's approach to climate change and how that impacts on their economies. This is what President Macky Sall of Senegal said last month. African economies are among those that are polluting less, but we are part of the world that's affected the most by the aftermath and the consequences. So don't add injustice onto the shoulders of Africa by no longer subsidising fossil fuels. Gyude, let me come to you. Do African countries feel Europe is properly supporting them towards a green transition?
No. So in the build-up to COP26, you saw the president of Malawi saying the same thing, the president of Uganda saying the same thing, the vice president of Nigeria saying the same thing, and now you have the president of Senegal saying the same thing. I think it comes to this point of what role, the transitional role of natural gas in the energy mix in Africa. And certain European countries started to advance the notion that bilateral financing and multilateral financing should no longer go into any kind of fossil fuels. And from the African perspective, where there needs to be a significant increase in the per capita consumption of energy, it was important to them that at least natural gas played some sort of role in the transition toward green energy. And if that funding was cut off, then Europe and the United States, who are largely responsible for the historical crisis we're in, are placing the burden of responding to that crisis on the people least responsible for contributing to it. And so for most African policymakers, they thought it was hypocritical, and they wanted Europe to change the stance when it came to that.
Yeah, and Geert, I mean, this is a long-held complaint by many developing countries that they are not being invested in sufficiently to move their economies towards greener energy.
Yes, absolutely. If we are talking green transformation and tackling climate change, enormous resources will be needed. And I fully take the point that the African side is not responsible for the global warming. Having said that, I think that there is this awareness in all parts of Africa as well, that collectively we have to tackle this issue. And there is definitely within Africa also something to be said between those countries who are fossil fuel producers and exporters, sometimes quite a few least developed countries who really want to cash in on their fossil fuels, and those who are much more dependent on all types of other renewable energies, countries like Namibia, for example. And I think also there, Africa needs to take a joint position, a joint stance in the global fora. This is one of the issues where Europe could sometimes be an ally, but it is not always a given. So it's very important there that the African continent gets its act together, and that they also fight to get transitional measures, because the end result of having green economies, I think everybody agrees on this. Yeah. It's more the transitional arrangements that need to be in place to make sure that Africa can slowly, gradually work towards these green transformation agendas. And there they need transitional measures, and they also need external funding.
So, gentlemen, we're coming to the end of the discussion, and what I want to do is just very quickly ask all three of you. We've talked about all the challenges and what Europe and Africa want to see happen, but I'm interested to know whether you think anything concrete is going to come out of the EU-AU summit. So let me start with you, Alex. What do you think we're going to see?
I think we'll see better delivery in the future of some of the commitments that the EU has made in terms of investments, of foreign direct investment and other commitments about providing a Green Deal. So it may be repackaged money, but it may be developed more. It may be provided more effectively.
And Geert, you mentioned that summits invariably end in disappointment because expectations are so high and frustrations are often not addressed. What do you think ultimately is this EU and AU summit will give us?
I think the connection needs to be made with the real world. What we are seeing is a lot of dynamics in Africa, a lot of dynamics as well amongst the younger generations in Europe. And these connections are de facto taking place. There's a lot of exchanges in the digital sectors between young Africans, young Europeans. There's a lot happening also at the level of local governments, cities who cooperate with each other in Africa and in Europe, private sector, small and medium enterprises. And that's the real beating heart of the Europe-Africa partnership, not the summit. And if the summit cannot make that connection with that real world, I think it will be a mistake. And I have my doubts whether the high-level events are really opening those enormous windows of opportunities.
And Gyude, final thought from you about what are you expecting from the EU-AU summit?
Well, I started off by saying I was cautiously optimistic, and I remain cautiously optimistic. I think Europe recognizes that the policy environment in Africa has changed. 2 decades ago, the only game in town was Europe and maybe the United States. Now we have the Chinese, we have the Gulf states, we have Russia, we have the Turkish. And so Europe understands that it has to deliver substantive outcomes on the commitments that is made. So I'm confident that because of the increasing complexity of policy in Africa, influence in Africa, and partnerships in Africa, it is in Europe's interest as much as it is in Africa as for Europe to deliver more. And so that's why I'm cautiously optimistic.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Great discussion. Gyude, Geert and Alex in the studio, thank you very much indeed. And you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. For now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye. Thanks for watching.